Good evening. My name is Ada Pittman Delancey, and I am the Communications Manager here at the Family Equality Council. On behalf of our Executive Director, Gabriel Blau, and our awesome programs team that actually organized this webinar this evening, we'd like to welcome you. I'd also like to take this time to welcome our presenter this evening, Mr. Johnny Cole. Thank you for your time and your contributions to the webinar. For those of you that aren't familiar with our organization, the Family Equality Council connects, supports, and represents the more than 3 million families, LGBTQ-headed families, and their children. We've been around for more than 30 years, and we work to change hearts and minds as well as policies relating to our families. We believe that all families should be respected, loved, and celebrated, and especially our LGBTQ-headed families. This evening's webinar, we will give you an opportunity to discuss matters of race and racial identity development, in addition to stereotypes and prejudices related to cross-racial adoptive families. A few housekeeping notes for everyone online. If you look at your actual screen, you should see a box that indicates where you can ask a question. If you do not see that box, there is a small 6-box grid in the upper corner of your screen. If you click on that and click the Q&A link, you will be able to submit questions during our Q&A portion of the webinar. During the webinar, you will be able to go ahead and start immediately submitting questions. We don't want you to hold off until the end, but we will not answer those questions until the designated time, which will be about 10 or 15 minutes before the end of the webinar. At this time, I'd like to introduce you all to Mr. Johnny Cole, who will serve as our presenter this evening. Johnny has been an educator for more than a dozen years. He currently works as a high school English teacher at Concord High School in Concord, Massachusetts, where he also lives openly in his community as a part of a transracial adoptive family. His husband is white. They have a daughter who is Black and a son who is also Latino. Throughout the year, he teaches graduate level anti-racist, pedagogy, courses with initiatives for developing equity and achievement for students. It was formerly entitled Empowering Multicultural Initiatives. Johnny earned a BS in Communication from Boston University and an MAT in Secondary English from the State University of New York at Cortland. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Mr. Johnny Cole. There you go. Take it away, Johnny.
All right. Thank you so much, Ada. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for joining us tonight. I am coming to you from the storm center of the country in New England, and it's nice to be able to be here. I don't have to travel anywhere. So I have a presentation that I'm going to switch over to here now, so that you don't have to just stare at me the whole time, and we can walk through some of what we're doing tonight. So what I thought we'd start with today in talking about racial identity and transracial adoptive families, or just to start out with some ground rules and talking about race. A lot of times these conversations can get tense, and it might be a little bit easier this time just because it's a one-way conversation at the moment. We're not interacting in a dialogue, but I do like some ground rules. The first one I like to present with is just to be curious, meaning understand that we all have a lot to learn. I've been doing this work for several years, and I'm constantly learning new things, and things are constantly shifting in our understanding of what's out there in terms of racial identity and how it impacts our families. Hold on to multiple realities is another important ground rule, and by that I mean we want to understand a both-and mentality, that one person's reality can be different from somebody else's, and yet they're both equally valid and important. At the same time, we want to be aware of intent versus impact, and having these conversations oftentimes when what we intend to say isn't always what the impact is on our audience, and so that's an important thing to think about as well. And also, stay the course. These are really difficult topics and conversations to have, especially when they relate to our children. And we're all learning. We should all be sort of trying things on, seeing how they fit for us. No one is the only expert. I'm bringing a lot of knowledge and expertise to the conversation tonight, but it's not. I'm not the only person that knows anything about these topics. And the big thing is to not expect closure when we have these conversations. That it's an ongoing process and a long process. I like this quote from Jay Smooth. He has a TED talk on, I think it's called How I Learned to Love Talking About Race. And he says we need to move away from the tonsils paradigm of race discourse towards the dental hygiene paradigm of race discourse. And it's sort of a humorous parallel, but he says that essentially, when we talk about race, a lot of times in this country, we have this tonsils paradigm where we say, oh, no, I'm not racist. I had my racism removed in 2007, as though they were our tonsils. And we need to have more of a dental hygiene paradigm where when someone says something like, you've got something stuck in your teeth, we don't say, oh, no, I brushed my teeth last week. We say thank you, and we get the thing out of our teeth. And that's the same thing with all this discourse about race, that when someone points out something that to us that impacts our actions or our behavior or the way that we've been talking, just to be thankful that alternative perspective has been pointed out to us. So those are the ground rules. I'll start with a little art project here. This is an art project that my son did last year in kindergarten. And my husband is Poppy there. I'm Daddy. Our granddaughter is the third from the left, and my son is on the right. It's an interesting portrait in that, first of all, I am not that much shorter than my husband. But what's interesting is that my son at 5 years old was able to articulate through this artistic project the different shades of skin in our family and the different racial features that we have. Again, my husband, Poppy, in this picture is white. I identify as Asian. My daughter is black, and our son is Latino. And so even very young kids, and research shows this, that really young kids identify racial markers. And that has become part of his family identity, even at that early age. This is the real thing. This is what we look like in real life. Again, you can see I'm not that much shorter than my husband. And so this is what our family looks like today, and it's obviously we are a multiracial family, a transracial adoptive family, and so these issues have come up a lot in both my professional life as an educator and in my personal life as a father. I started thinking about this topic when I went to graduate school to get a teaching degree in around 2000. And I went to a nationally accredited school, which means that the teaching degree that students get from that school now is good in all 50 states. And in hindsight, I look back and I see that there was very little focus on racial identity and education and the importance of it and its role that it plays. And then when I began teaching in 2002 in a semi-urban district just outside of Boston, the teaching staff was almost entirely white, and the student body was almost 50% students of color. And there was no emphasis on racial identity and education in that environment, which, again, in hindsight, seems really strange to me. And so in 2007, there's a picture of our daughter when she was born. She was born February 26, 2007. She came into our life, and obviously, we adopting a black baby, we started to look at these issues a little bit differently. At the same time, I took a new job at a METCO school district, and for those of you not in the Boston area, METCO is a voluntary desegregation program in the suburban schools outside of Boston, and I think it's about 40 years old now, and it is a program for the predominantly white suburbs to diversify racially. And so students from Boston come out to these suburb schools. The school that I teach at, we have, I think it's about 5 or 6% of our student body come from Boston, and it's only students of color that can enroll in that program. And at this new school that I was at, it was a METCO program school, there was a major emphasis on racial identity in education and the implications in education. All teachers at the time were required to take a 36-hour graduate course in racial identity and how it impacts education, and that's in spite of a really small number of students of color at this school and a predominantly white teaching staff at the school. So I sort of found it interesting at this time that a school district which had a large student of color population didn't quite have the emphasis that this white suburban school did. And I started getting really interested in this topic and taking more classes. And then in 2009, my son came to live with us, and he, again, is Latino. And shortly after that, we went to our first family week. And I was struck at Family Week in Provincetown, that Family Equality runs in Provincetown every summer, just at the number of trans-adoptive families that are in our community. That there are many parents who have adopted children that do not share the same racial background as they do. And so it made me realize that this was an important topic for our community. So that brings us to today and why we're here today. And the first thing I wanted to talk about in this topic is just what is identity, because when we're talking about fostering a positive racial identity development for our children, we have to sort of have a good understanding of what identity is in the first place. In the work that I do, we use these 8 markers as sort of the principal elements of identity: gender, race, sexuality, religion, class and wealth, our age, the languages we speak, and the ethnicity and ancestry of our families. Now these 8 things, you can imagine for yourselves, at different times in your life, probably took a greater precedence over the other aspects of your identity in making up who you are, and that's true for our kids as well. And each of these, of course, are impacted and influenced by one another. I imagine we have a large LGBT audience tonight, and I know in my life that sexuality certainly eclipsed a lot of my other identity markers when I was an adolescent, for example, and then other things came up as I got older. These are also impacted by other aspects of identity: education, job, our family or birth order, our disability status. All of those things are impacted, impact these pieces, and again, may bring other aspects into greater focus at times during our life. So the other thing I want to say about identity is that Andrew Solomon, in his book Far from the Tree, which is a really terrific book about identity, he actually breaks these identities into 2 types, and he says because of the transmission of identity from one generation to the next, most children share at least some traits with their parents. These are vertical identities. Attributes and values are passed down from parent to child across the generations, not only through strands of DNA, but also through shared cultural norms. And for many of us, ethnicity is a vertical identity. We learn about our ethnicity from our parents. It's passed down from our parents, either implicitly or explicitly. And there are other aspects of identity that are vertical. Race in other families, in traditional families, is typically a vertical identity. In our families, it is not, obviously. Language is typically a vertical identity, and religion is typically a moderately vertical identity. And then he talks about how there are other aspects of identity. Someone has an inherent or acquired trait that is foreign to his or her parents and must therefore acquire identity from a peer group. That's a horizontal identity. Again, assuming most of our audience here is LGBT, most of us, that is a horizontal identity. I didn't learn how to be a gay man and its impact on my identity from my parents. I got that from a peer group and from a culture outside of my family. And so for our children in LGBT-headed transracial adoptive families, racial identity is going to be, for the most part, a horizontal identity for them. And so that's an important thing to think about as we go through these through this topic. And so we want to think about, what are the positive ways we can develop that identity, and we also have to be okay with not necessarily having all the answers in the same way that we would in a vertical identity that we pass on to our children. And we can empathize with that aspect of their identity, and yet that's something I'll talk a little bit about later. And just a quick note on language as we start talking about race here. In the work I do, we use we use the major categories of white, Native American, Black, which is someone of African heritage, and Asian American as racial categories. Race is a socially constructed idea, and there's a lot more information about that. Maybe we can answer some of that about the question and answer period if anyone has more questions about that. But race changes across context and history and culture. So for American racial discourse work today, the major categories again are white, Native American, Black, and Asian American. And if someone wants to hear about it later, maybe in the Q&A section, I can talk about why we don't use Caucasian. So this is our where we are in terms of identity. And then the other thing I wanted to address before we really get into what we can do for our children is why do we have to talk about this stuff? Again, for a lot of people, this is something that we're sort of taught not to talk about, and it can be an uncomfortable topic for a lot of people. I know in my family, particularly when we brought home my daughter, it was a hard topic in a lot of regards. So one of the first questions is, isn't a person just a person? Why do we have to sort of categorize them by race? And this is a little bit of that colorblind mentality. I know when we brought our daughter home, one of my in-laws said to us, when I look at my granddaughter, I don't see white, I don't see Black, I just see a baby. And that's something that in American history, that's a very common idea that we don't see color when we look at somebody. And this is a problematic idea. If anyone was able to do the pre-reading articles that were sent out in the article by Gina Miranda Samuels, Not Just White Parents with Kids of Color, the Importance of Racial Identity Work for Parents, she makes it pretty clear why this doesn't work. Jane Elliott, who has done a lot of this work as well, she's famous for that blue-eyed experiment. She often will ask a white woman in workshops, how she would feel if someone said, when I look at you, I don't see gender, I just see a person, I don't see a woman, I just see a person. And for most people who identify as women, that's a huge part of their identity. And as society as a whole is willing to talk about how almost every other marker impacts identity, and yet often we have a hard time talking about the racial equity piece of that. The other thing I'll mention on the colorblind mentality is Melody Hobson, who I think is the CEO of DreamWorks or some big Hollywood film company. She has a great TED Talk about the importance of being color brave instead of being color blind. And so if you're interested in that topic, that's another really great resource out there. We hear a lot of times too, can't we focus on how we're similar instead of how we're different? And we can definitely do that. And I think that's what's important though is that we don't do it instead. We don't focus on how we're similar instead of how we're different, but in addition to how we're different. There's been a lot of studies out there on the impact of group dynamics and how we work with one another. John DeVideo, who's a professor of psychology at Yale, did a study recently where they had groups of people who wanted to think of themselves as different members of different identity groups or as all members of the same group. So for example, in people attending this webinar tonight, we are all, for the most part, LGBT trans adoptive parents. And so to focus on that similarity certainly does promote productivity and harmony. And the more we think of ourselves as just one group, though, we are going to ignore group differences and be less sensitive to group-based disparities. And that's what John DeVideo's research has found. And so when we say something like, shouldn't we all be measured by the same standards, shouldn't I treat my Black child the same way that any parent would treat his or her child? What DeVideo's work actually found was that when we focus on commonalities, we apply the same standards to everybody, but it's the standards of the dominant group, and everybody gets judged by the standards that benefit members of the dominant group. So focusing on those commonalities might improve attitudes, but it obscures inequalities and unfairness among different subgroups, and it undermines anything that would compel people in the dominant group to action, to create equality. And dominant groups strategically, historically, and socially use superficial commonality to maintain the status quo and the stability of their advantage. And that's the case with our children. And if you want to think about it in terms of it, this, if you just think about our families in relation to the heteronormative standard that's out there, it would be a disservice to our children to simply treat them the same way that traditional heterosexual families treat their children, and how they're treated in education and as they grow up and become adolescents and whatnot. So our families are just as normal as traditional biological families, headed by a married male and a female, and our families also need to be treated differently when issues of opportunity and power are considered. This affects so much from the this affects a lot from the ways our families are represented in the media to what the media that our children experience. I know even, for example, at my children's elementary school, they have a mom's night out. We have been consistently invited to this mom's night out, which is just problematic for us as two dads. And it's I don't know that excluding us would have been the answer to. It's just an example of how that heteronormative standard can be applied to people that are traditionally marginalized, like our families. And the same is true of racial dynamics in our society and our communities and our families. When we focus on differences of race, especially those that have been historically marginalized through legislated and institutionalized systemic racist practices, that doesn't mean we can't get to a happy place. That doesn't mean we can work through these things. However, there's another great TED Talk out there by Verna Myers who says, we have to get uncomfortable before we get comfortable, and that's okay. We have to acknowledge that that's part of the process, and that will provide more comfort for our families as we move forward. Adoptive families have the option of raising children within their own ethnic background or with the background of their kids or some combination thereof. So as we talk about this, you certainly want to think a little bit about raising your own kids. Your kids may or may not have the ethnic experience of your family, depending on how you choose to raise them. However, they will certainly have their racial experience at some point in their lives, and that something will happen that will bring that racial experience into focus, and that will be something that is different than what you or I can provide our children. So this is a great clip that's online in a lot of education circles about the idea of equality versus equity. Again, we're talking about treating everyone the same or differently. The idea of equality here, everybody gets a box, and like all three of these kids are trying to watch this baseball game, and the little kid still can't see the baseball game. Whereas equity is everyone gets what they need. The tall kid doesn't need the box because he can see over the fence without it, and then the little kid needs two boxes to see over the fence. So when we're talking about championing these issues for our children, it's really about equity and not about equality, and sometimes those things get confused with one another. So getting to what can we do now for our children. The first thing is we can educate ourselves. If we have a deaf child, if we adopted a deaf child, we learn about parenting a deaf child. It's the same thing with children of different racial backgrounds than our own. It's a different experience, and we need to understand that parenting that child might be different than the sort of common sense approach. So get out there and educate yourself about power and privilege. Read some articles, read some books, read some blogs. There's a lot of really great stuff out there. Mandatory, absolutely, is Peggy McIntosh. She has an article that's pretty short. You can find it online, called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. If you haven't read it, it's really the sort of industry standard on white privilege and how it functions in our society. There's a lot of other great stuff out there that I can recommend if you're at a loss of what to look at. Read about your child's racial perspective too. Pick up some the same materials for whatever racial group that your child is a part of. You want to learn about bias. There's a lot of research and science about bias, and it's been in the news a lot, particularly with all of the events in Ferguson, Missouri last year, and in New York, and Staten Island. Racial bias affects good people. It affects everyone, all of us. I am constantly trying to make myself aware of how much it affects me, and I do this work, I have this family, and I am still affected by it, and we have to sort of be conscious of it in order to counteract it. You want to change your mindset about race and racism, again, change the way you think about this discourse and the existence of race, racism, and how it functions in our lives. take a workshop. You're here, so that's a really good thing you can do. You know, there's a lot of other important things. You know, if you just Google redlining, if you don't know about redlining, that's a really important piece of African American history in this country. Google stereotype threat, the idea that the proven effect that just knowledge of a stereotype can make someone perform better or worse at a task. For example, you know, science. Reminding a girl that she's a girl before she takes a science test will make her do worse. Reminding an Asian kid that he's Asian before he takes a test will make him do better. And that's simply because of the stereotypes that are out there. So just learn about this stuff. There's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of really great films, documentaries out there. There's even some really great ones about families like ours. And you know, you can even take the implicit association test yourself. You just Google IAT. There's an online test you can take. I think it's out of Harvard about implicit association and how it affects us. Carol Dweck even is a big person in this field, in the field of education, and how race impacts education, and she was even featured on This American Life last week. And there's also some really great mainstream articles just on various news sites and stuff. And so once you get to understand all of that, you get a sense of how the cycle of oppression works in our society. This is a really simplified version of a lot of people's work, but essentially we have these stereotypes. The stereotypes are the thing that all of us have. We all have these preconceived notions, and we all have them because of the media we're subjected to and whatnot. And then for some people, it reaches the stereotypes feed into prejudice, which are the beliefs of superiority over a certain group of people. And then prejudice leads into discrimination, which is action. So the beliefs at the idea level and prejudice then lead to the discrimination, the action level, which leads to oppression when it gets to the sort of systematic, the systemic, the institutional level, which then actually makes people internalize, the people who are being oppressed. It makes them internalize that oppression, and they actually start to think, well, maybe the stereotypes are true, and then they start to behave like the stereotypes, which then just feeds this cycle over and over and over. And if people want to know more about that, I can maybe answer some questions about that in the Q&A session. So once you sort of have thought all about this stuff, you've educated yourself, then you really want to start to think about how racial identity develops and understand how it develops, and think about how it's developed in yourself as an adult and how it is likely to develop in your children. This is just a quick overview of how racial identity develops for white people based on the work of Janet Helms. She starts with this contact phase, which is when you see there's nothing wrong with the status quo. You see yourself as normal instead and not white. Like I don't have a racial identity because I'm white. And it's possible for people to stay in this stage their entire lives. I do this work with adult educators, and it's not uncommon for us to have a 40 or 50-year-old person in the class who has until that moment been in the contact stage for her or his entire life. Once you start to get out of the contact stage, you get into the disintegration stage. You start to raise an awareness of racism and white privilege and how it functions in society. You start to feel feelings of discomfort, guilt, anger, shame, confusion, totally normal, and you're starting to step off the cycle of oppression at that point. And for some people, this is what happens after you start really researching this stuff and looking into it, educating yourself. And then you hit the reintegration phase. You start to isolate yourself a little bit from friends. You start to retreat into old patterns. Perhaps you start blaming people of color, absolving whites of responsibility. And this is, again, a normal process because of these feelings in the disintegration stage of discomfort, guilt, etc. And then you might step back on the cycle. That's just a little bit of a regression there, and that's, again, a normal part of this process. Then the pseudo-independence level, where this is often a result of cross-racial interactions. We start to push ourselves out of our comfort zone and start to actually meet people and have authentic relationships with people of color. And you can't ignore systems of privilege and oppression, and so you enter the pseudo-independent stage. You start to accept personal responsibility for dismantling racism. You seek out people of color. You think, like, I have a role to play here. And you see whiteness is still a source of shame rather than pride at this point. Again, the normal process, part of this process. You get off the cycle, but you realize that you need to find a more personal or more positive self-definition in order to move forward. Then you reach the immersion stage. You start to look for new information about what it means to be white, searching for alternatives, something better than just always thinking of whiteness as a victimizer. And then the guilt and the shame start to fade away. You start to take pride in your anti-racist activities, and that's increased by finding white allies who agree that this work is important, and you continue to work to stay off the cycle. And then the last stage is autonomy. You internalize a positive sense of whiteness, not based on superiority, and you continue to work to stay off the cycle. If you notice, even at this last level, you're working to stay off the cycle. Beverly Daniel Tatum, who is an awesome person in this field, she uses the analogy of being on a moving walkway, and that in this work, that if you're doing nothing, you're going with the flow, which is the cycle of oppression and sort of moving towards that sort of racist mentality. And in order to actually do this work effectively, you have to walk against that moving walkway, and if you stop at any time, you'll just be carried back. So that's a good way to think about it. And then there's a different model for people of color. So some of you are probably people of color out there. I identify with this racial identity development scale, and our children will, I'm sure. So this is based on the work of William Cross, who did his work, I think, in the 70s, and he did it primarily with African Americans, and it's been expanded to include almost all people of color. It's a parallel journey to the white one, but you'll see that it's a little different. The pre-encounter stage is when people are absorbed by images, beliefs, values of the dominant group. In America, that is, the dominant group is the white group. There's a belief in normalcy, all people are the same, and children might express at this time a desire to be white, and that's a really normal thing, whether it's a transracial adopted family or a biologically racial family. That's normal to be in that pre-encounter phase. And then at some point, the individual will enter the encounter phase. And this is what's really important for transracial adopted parents to understand. Racism makes the individual feel inferior. So there will be some instance where the individual will encounter racism in some way, and they'll be made to feel inferior. And there's this realization that race alone can lead to negative treatment. And that's where this development of mistrust toward dominant group members, again in America, that's the white group, that's where that comes from. And then the individual begins to grapple with what it means to be a member of a targeted group. Now, before I go on with this, this development scale for people of color, I wanted to just say that the encounter phase can happen at different times for different people. I work with adolescents, I work with teenagers, and a lot of times I'll see them as a 10th grader, and they're still in the pre-encounter phase, and we'll have conversations, and they're so clearly in that phase. And then when I talk to them again as a senior in 12th grade, they've already had that experience, and then we're able to say, like, remember when we had that conversation when you were in 10th grade, and they have a different perspective on it. And so that's why it's really important that we do provide a good foundation for our kids, because when they get to the encounter phase, it will cause them to sort of question previous encounters in the pre-encounter phase, if that makes sense. So once they go through that, then they get into the immersion stage, which is when the person of color is exposed to new thinking about his or her race, becomes engaged in self-research. What does it mean to be who I am? There is a development of a positive self-image here, which is a really important thing for our kids. And this is the beginning of the creation of a newly defined affirmation of self, which is certainly where we want our kids to be. And then the second to last stage is internalization. There's this representation of self as confident, secure, proud, in multiracial settings. So at this point, they're starting to really make sense of being around people that are different from them, and being okay with that, and finding pride and confidence in that. They're building coalitions with others. oppressed historically, excluded groups. They're starting to see that there's parallels in our experiences, whereas in the immersion phase, there might be a little bit more of a gravitation towards people that are like them racially. And in this internalization phase, there's a recognition of shared oppressions with a broad range of societal groups and the will to promote change. And so just as with the white development scale, you have a movement towards essentially affecting change. That's part of the person of color's change, as person of color's development as well. And then finally, the last is the internalization commitment stage. There's this commitment to promote his or her community within the larger society and sort of work together and build coalitions to make a difference. You know, the end stage for people of color in this racial identity development model, most people can spend their entire lives getting there, whether they identify as a white person or a person of color. And it's work. It's work to get there and to stay there. And these are really, you know, they're not necessarily so linear, these phases, that you know, people can sort of fade in and out of different phases at different times in their life, depending on contexts. And so that's just an important piece to remember as well. And you can probably, as you're looking at this development of people of color model, there's probably a lot of similarities for those of us that identify as LGBT in the ways that we came to terms with our sexuality and how it impacts our identity. And I think that's important. It's important to empathize with aspects of this, as long as we understand that it's not the same as a racial identity development, because of the implications of race in our nation's history, and also because of the fact that for most people race cannot be hidden, whereas for many of us sexuality can be hidden if we choose to hide it. And so just that's something to keep in mind as we think about this for our kids. So getting back to what we can do after we sort of understand how racial identity develops, I know that was a really fast overview of some complicated topics. We can provide authentic opportunities for our children and to see positive examples of their racial identity, and that's really important. You know, so what can we do? We can evaluate the media that our children are exposed to, and there's a lot of different thinking on this. You know, I have a lot of friends that are like super duper into Disney, and I think Disney's fun and great, and I've taken my kids to Disney World and they love it, and I loved it. And I think there's a certain social capital that comes with knowing about Disney. I mean, they have such a power, there's such a powerful media influence, and yet that media doesn't come into our home without a conversation. You know, we talk about the representations of people of color, of gender, of all of the different ways that they often portray stereotypes, and then occasionally combat them, which is good when they can do that. So so evaluate the media, and I'm not saying that we need to just like shield our kids from anything out there that maybe portrays stereotypical behavior of people of color, but just to make sure that they have you're having a conversation about it. And there are age-appropriate ways to do that. Even we were having that conversation with our kids when they were 2 and 3 years old. Then get out of your comfort zone. Again, Verna Meyer says you need to get uncomfortable before you get comfortable, and that's really important. Find places that, you know, things that you wouldn't do typically. I know a couple years ago, another transracial adoptive family invited us to go see the Black Nativity in Boston. That's something that we would never have done on our own, and we took our kids a couple of years in a row, and it was a really great experience. You know, finding opportunities for them to see positive examples of people that are in their racial identity group. And I can tell you my daughter is 7 years old now, and a lot of those experiences where we've taken her out really resonate with her. She talks about them a lot. You also want to be ready for confrontation. There is going to be some pushback, certainly. There are certain groups, you know, so just like there's pushback on the mere existence of our families, there's also going to be pushback in the existence of a multiracial family like ours are. I mean, we even, my husband and I had an experience. We were in Hartford, Connecticut, just walking down the street with our kids. We were just visiting the city, and someone pulled over. It was a Black woman, and she accused us of having kidnapped these 2 children, and it was a really strange and awful experience. And and we had to have a big talk with our kids afterwards. You know, there's going to be confrontation from different aspects of putting our kids out there and trying to make sure that they have a good foundation. And I feel good that even after that experience that could have been pretty traumatic for our kids, they came out of it okay because of the work that we've done in terms of affirming who they are and what our family is. And then the last thing we can do is just to get to autonomy. You want to be a warrior for your children, for others. So get to that, you know, if you are a person that identifies as a white person, get to that last stage of racial identity development and just be a warrior for your kids. There are a lot of things that we can do. The first thing I always say in this regard is you want to be respectful and tenacious in this work. So whether you're approaching a teacher or a neighbor or a family member or the parents of one of your kids' friends, you can be respectful while still being tenacious about these issues. In schools, you want to ask about curriculum. You know, how are different racial groups presented in the curriculum? You want to be wary of what the Nigerian author Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of a single story, which is another great TED Talk she has. You know, you want to make sure that whatever racial group is being represented is not just represented once, and then that represents the entire cultural group. You also want to look around. You know, look around your kid's classroom and what posters are up on the wall. Research shows that kids of color do better when they can see images of themselves in the classroom. So if there's a quote from Martin Luther King on the wall, is there a picture of him next to that quote? And by the way, research also shows that that is good for white students as well. It doesn't just impact the kids of color. You want to acknowledge bias too. I think that it's been helpful in my work, both as an educator and working with parents of kids of color, and also in my work as a parent to a child of color, to not ask like, so do you know about bias? Do you know how it plays out in education? But just to acknowledge, to say, you know, I'm well aware of the science and the research around how bias shows up in the classroom. I'm curious what you would do as an educator to counteract that. So to sort of put it out there that it's not a question of whether it exists or not. It's about what are the educators in your children's schools doing to counteract racial bias. Ask about professional development. That's a good question for the principal. You know, what kind of professional development does the staff undergo in this area? And I always like to say how often too. I think that this is professional development that needs to happen annually, just because of how important it is. And so you want to ask about cultural proficiency. You know, is a word that's being tossed around a lot. I know in Massachusetts, it's one of our state standards that teachers are supposed to be evaluated on. And so there's a lot of ways you get your foot in the door on that regard. The other thing I'll say about schools, I have written a letter every year that my kids are in school about how important these issues are, and I deliver it to the principal every year. And I say things like, it's really important that my children be placed with other children of color, if at all possible, so that they're not the only person in the room. I do the same thing with adoptive kids and other LGBT-headed family kids. I also make it a point to say that I do not want them placed in a classroom with a teacher who has not done graduate level work in this area, because when I started doing this work, I realized there were a lot of sort of common sense things that teachers could do that were actually detrimental to both kids of color and white students. And the last thing I'll say is just family and friends. That can also be an issue in bringing these issues up with family and friends. I know that can sometimes be harder than you know, some of the school people out there. So there's a strategy called felt, found, feel that's really effective, and so what you basically do is you know, you acknowledge. This is actually a modification on something that's used in sales, and so you acknowledge how they feel by saying, well, I felt that way once too, and then I found out X, and now I feel this way. So for example, you know, you might say, you know, the Oscar nominations came out last week, and if you see the news, it's like the first time in 20 or 30 years that there have been no people of color nominated for any of the acting awards. So you might say, you know, a few years ago I would have felt that people making a fuss about there being no people of color nominated for acting categories this year was ridiculous. But then I found out through reading a few books and even talking with my black daughter that reinforces the idea that white actors are somehow inherently better. And now I feel like it's a problem because of the implicit messages it sends, and also because it exposes the access to opportunity for people of color in show business. Just as an example of a way that you can sort of use that strategy to sort of put yourself out there with people that you care about, and that can be a little bit harder than doing it with some other people. And so that's where, let's see if I can stop this. Am I back? So that's what I've prepared. I've got a couple other things I can go a little bit more in depth into if. I
think we're at a good time right now. You actually hit right at the mark. So I currently have I have one question in the chat. I wanted to go ahead and explain to anyone that joined us later that there is a question and answer application that you all can pull up and submit questions. If you're currently looking at your screen, there is a 6 square grid in your top, it's the upper right-hand corner, and if you click on that, you can click on the Q&A app. It's a blue link, blue icon rather. It says Q&A, and if you have any questions, you can go ahead and submit your questions. The first question that I have for you, Johnny, it comes in, it says, should I acknowledge horizontal, vertical identities with my child? If so, what age is appropriate to do so?
That's a great question. I think it's totally appropriate to acknowledge these identities because our families typically are so different than the families that they're seeing in their friend groups, their peer groups, and in the media. For the most part, we're probably already acknowledging. I know that when our kids were really young, we talked a lot about how our family was different from other families. We had 2 dads, and some families have 2 moms, and a lot of families have a mom and a dad, and giving all those different ways that people can make a family. And so, in terms of talking about horizontal and vertical identities, I think that's something that you can talk to kids about too. I think that you do it in an age-appropriate way. So for very young kids, 2 or 3, we would talk with our kids. We put our arms next to each other and say, like, isn't it so beautiful that we all have different colored skin and we're still a family? And our kids at that age, I remember, liked it a lot when we sort of taught there's a great book called The Colors of Us. It's a picture book, and it goes through all the different kinds of skin color, and it sort of relates each of them to food, and that is what our kids really responded to a lot when they were really young. And then we were able to sort of mature that conversation a little bit as they got older. So I don't think it's ever too early to start talking about that stuff. I mean, research shows that kids really, really young are able to acknowledge differences in race, I think as early as 1 or 2. I can't hear anything.
I apologize. We had about 5 or 6 individuals that hopped on the webinar a short time after you started discussing horizontal and vertical. So if you don't mind just giving kind of a brief on that to lend to the question, and then I'll move to the second one. Okay.
So just to recap, so horizontal and vertical identities is something that Andrew Solomon came up with, and he wrote a book called Far from the Tree. It was published a couple years ago. It's a really great book. It's a really long book, but it's a book where he examines. He does a different chapter on different types of kids, and it's the idea of kids who have horizontal identities from their parents. And a horizontal identity, he says, is an identity where someone has an inherent or acquired trait that is foreign to his or her parents and must therefore acquire identity from the peer group. So, and that's different from a vertical identity, which is something that you get from your parents, which is typically things like race is often a vertical identity, language is typically a vertical identity, religion is usually a vertical identity. And so these horizontal identities, the book actually looks at different, so there's a whole chapter on deaf children, born to hearing parents. There's a chapter on dwarfs who are born to regular height parents. There's a chapter even on Down syndrome kids. So that's what his book is about, is sort of looking at those different, how do you parent a child who have to provide a foundation for a horizontal identity. And so that's how it sort of relates to our families and transracial adoptive families, in that we have adopted children who have a different racial background than we do, a different racial identity, and so therefore it is a horizontal identity for them.
Thank you. You also mentioned just bringing up race and this matter in school and with the teachers. So asking about professional development, can you reference some articles or places people can go to kind of check what's the most current professional development that they should be seeking, or where do they go to say, hey, I would like you all to make sure that your teachers are up to date on matters that pertain to my family? Is there a reference point that you can provide for everyone online today?
Yeah, for teachers, it's always good to ask if teachers are aware of a website called Teaching Tolerance. They have a really... Can
you say that again? You broke out a little bit.
Sorry, Teaching Tolerance.
Teaching Tolerance.
I think teachingtolerance.org, I think, is the website, and that's a great resource for educators. They have a lot of research on there, a lot of lesson plans and ways to close the achievement gap. That's a good sort of test to see, if your child's teacher knows about that source or if the principal knows about it. And it's also sort of a nice thing that you can always say, like, send it in an email and say, this is a great resource that I have found that is helpful for families like ours. Ideally, they're doing more, sort of graduate level work on a regular basis. I know the organization that I work with has a lot of courses for teachers, and certain districts around the Boston area, I know, like, they require it. And so that might be, if you're looking to make a move to a community where your kids will be taken care of in the education system, that would be something to ask them. What type of professional development do you have, and is it required for your teachers, or is it optional? Obviously required is better. Optional is okay too, though.
Okay, thank you for that. You mentioned an incident where you personally were addressed by a young woman or a lady regarding your child. Do you have any advice for parents that may experience a similar situation?
Yeah, I would say 9 times out of 10, interactions are really great. So I threw that out there only because we do have to be prepared for it. I think that we are prepared for, often, being LGBT families, we often try to be prepared for people who question the heads of our family, that we have 2 dads and 2 moms, or a single mom. And sometimes we aren't as prepared for the stuff that comes at us that's race-driven. And so I guess my advice is just stand your ground and know that your family is terrific and great. And I think that's looking back in that incident that we had in Hartford, I don't know that we would have played it out the same way that we did. And yet we definitely at the time, we said, well, this is our family. And I know the woman said, but you're different colors. And I said, I know, and this is what families look like in the 21st century. And so I don't know that I have any advice about how to get through it, other than just to expect that it's going to happen. And I know that there's no right way and no wrong way to sort of get through that. I think that what's important, if the interaction is with someone that you know, I always recommend, after that, going back and think after you've had a chance to think it over and say, you know what, the other day when we had that conversation about X, Y, and Z, here's what I was thinking, and to revisit the conversation. I do that with students all the time. When it's with a stranger, obviously, you don't always have that opportunity, and so then it's important to revisit it with your family and just sort of after you've had a chance to think about it and process it. I think that that's always been what's been good for us as parents, is that when we don't feel like we addressed it so well in the moment, we always try to revisit it, ideally with the person that was involved in whatever it was, but then also for sure with our kids. Great.
And in keeping with time, I'm going to allow this to be the last question. Speaking in reference to the notion of children seeing images of themselves in school and ensuring that information is available in the actual classrooms, is it important to also facilitate opportunities for the children to interact with people of the same race outside of school? Is that important for their development?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely important. It's definitely I think something that we want to do for our kids. We definitely should do that. I think so. So again, looking at some of the research around education, the research has shown that students of color typically will learn better from someone who is of their same racial group. That doesn't mean that they can't learn from a white teacher or from another racial group. It just means that like they have the best odds with that, and I think that that's probably true for just role models in general. And that's why it's really important that when we have predominantly white teaching staffs, which is the case in most of the country, teaching kids of color, that they do have the training so that they can be just as effective as a person of color in teaching those kids. But I think outside of the school environment, absolutely, I think it's important that we find opportunities for our kids to have role models that they know. You know, I know we have a really dear friend, a Black woman who has taken our daughter under her wing and has been awesome with her, and our daughter just responds to her in such an important way. And we have to be okay sort of stepping back a little bit when that relationship is going on. So yeah, it's definitely important.
Okay. Well, Johnny, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us this evening. It was very informative. We had a final question that came in. So for anyone that joined us a little later in the broadcast, if you weren't able to catch the beginning of Johnny's presentation, we will publish this on our website. You can visit our website at www.familyequality.org. And we will publish this link to this video, and you will be able to watch it and hear the entire presentation. So on behalf of the Family Equality Council, Johnny, again, thank you so much. And we look forward to you all joining us at another webinar. Please check out our website. We update our events monthly. Again, you can go to familyequality.org and click on the events page, and you can click on webinars and see what we have upcoming. You can also check us out on Facebook and Twitter. We're Family Equality Council on Facebook and Family Equality on Twitter. And that's where you can find the latest updates. Thank you again for attending, and everyone, you all have a great night.
Thank you.